When you know the fourfoil in all its seasons, root and leaf and flower, by sight and scent and seed, then you may learn its true name, knowing its being, which is more than its use. What after all is the use of you, or of myself? Is Gont mountain useful, or the open sea? Guin went on a half-mile or so, and said at last, "To hear, one must be silent." Hello everyone and welcome back to my novel review, the Book Podcast. If you are a lover of books, then you are in the right place. My name is Seamus and this is my little podcasting show where every week I discuss a different book. Every month I also discuss a different fantasy book, and this month is no different. We're kicking off a new series, Earthsea by Ursula K. Guin. Possibly the first 4 books. This particular edition has the first 4 books, but at this stage I'm uncertain if I actually need to read the 4th book to round out the first story arc of what is being explored in the first 3 books. I'll decide when I get there. I'll figure out if I get there. Last month I did Book of the New Sun, or the last 4 months I did Book of the New Sun, which was an absolutely bafflingly, thrillingly, enjoyably confusing journey of a story. So this is a very different change of pace, and I am quite happy about that. I did absolutely love Books of the New Sun, but this is I think a very healthy change of pace. So yeah, it should be fun. I've had an absolutely great time reading. I've read the first 2 books because each book is around 150 pages. And to be honest, because I love fantasy and I love writing and I love fantasy writing and reading, I've read the first 2 books in preparation for this episode. And then for the next episode, I will be reading the 3rd and possibly the 4th book as well for that. So yeah, today I am discussing the Wizard of Earthsea and the Tombs of Atuan, the first 2 books of Earthsea. So that should be really fun. Before I get into the episode though, I just want to say thanks so much for clicking on, guys. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoy it. If you would like to like and subscribe, that would absolutely make my day. But as always, it's a free podcast, so let's just enjoy the show. Okay, let's get into the first book, The Wizard of Earthsea. This was my first time reading any Ursula K. Le Guin. I'd of course heard of her. She's an incredibly famous writer, but I'd yet to dip my toe into anything. There's actually a copy of The Left Hand of Darkness just on the bookshelf to my right. And yeah, I'd never read anything of Ursula. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't know anything beyond knowing that she was, of course, an incredibly famous writer, but that, of course, does not mean that I'm necessarily going to enjoy her writing style. So yeah, there's always that kind of like tentativeness the first time you read a new writer, and I had absolutely nothing to be worried about. She is an incredible writer. I mean, reading this story, and I don't know, maybe it's just my experience after reading Book of the New Sun, because that is famously incredibly dense and complex and really confusing, and everyone sort of struggles with their first read, and everyone kind of loves that they struggle with their first read. I think maybe reading that and then jumping into this story just made this story so much better. That's not to say that I don't think it's an incredibly great story on its own. But then to finish that series and to jump into this series, Earthsea, was, I think, just absolutely wonderful, because this is a relatively straightforward series at this stage, and it's just so beautifully written, beautifully crafted, that it feels like I'm just a young child again being told a story. It feels like I'm, sort of in bed and my father's reading me a book again, or it feels like I'm sitting around a campfire simply being told just a great tale, and it's really enjoyable. I think one of the beautiful things about this story, and the Tombs of Atuan as well, I'm sort of speaking about both at the moment, is that there is something there if you want to delve deeper, but on the surface it is just a really nice, simple, thrilling tale, and you can just enjoy it for that aspect as just being this wonderful story. But if you do sort of want to peel back the layers of the story as well and delve a bit deeper, that is definitely there for you. But yeah, just a wonderful, simple, beautiful story. Let's get into The Wizard of Earthsea in a bit more detail. I've got my notes here. I came across a word that I had never heard of, but everyone was sort of throwing around when I was sort of reading about this book. It's Bildungsroman, which means a coming-of-age story, and I'd never heard that. Everyone just calls it a coming-of-age story. When I was coming through university, it was just, everyone just said coming-of-age. No one ever said the word Bildungsroman. I should look into that word, because I don't know where it comes from and why that at all means coming of age. But this is very much a coming of age story. I think a very brief overview is Ged is from Gont. Lovely name, Ged from Gont. I kind of love that. And he discovers that he's kind of got this magical capability. He's then sent off to be taught by this guy. This guy is like, look, you can stay here and keep learning from me, but Ged kind of wants to move on. He then goes to a school of magic where he then sort of gets on the wrong side of some boys. He then has a little magical jewel, accidentally unleashes a dark shadow that then follows him around for the rest of the story, trying to, I guess, consume his body. And the story is about Ged sort of leaving school, growing up, leaving school, graduating as a wizard, and then having to struggle through the daily life of being a wizard and fulfilling what that entails, but then of course also being pursued by this dark shadow. And I think it is a relatively simple story. It is quite traditional in that sense, but that doesn't mean it's any less enjoyable. That was an incredibly rough, brief overview. I hope that did, well, I know it didn't do it any justice, but that is pretty much the story. I mean, that was a pretty swift overview, actually. And one thing I really loved and appreciated about this story was it is also quite swift in itself. We don't waste too much time on anything. We sort of grow up, and within a few pages, Ged's got his magical capabilities. He doesn't quite know how to use them. And then within a few more pages, he's off to his first teacher, Ogion. He's then within a few pages going off to this magical school. And it's moving with this nice swiftness where it doesn't feel like it's bogged down, but it's also giving just enough attention to every kind of detail of the story that we're not feel like we're necessarily rushing through things. And so really it just feels like we're not wasting time to get into, because it's obviously trying to do a fair amount of world building, of course, but without getting bogged down in the nitty gritty of every little detail that's going on. I actually did a 3-minute snippet on sort of the differences between soft world building and hard world building if you want to go check them out. But it's this idea of, just she's not hard world building, but she's not soft world building. She clearly understands, this is Ursula I'm talking about, she clearly understands the world she's writing in, and for that she's just moving through with this relative swiftness that keeps us quite engaged in the early stages of this story. So something I loved about this story was, I think very early on it almost alludes to what the overarching story is, and it's sort of one of those things that you can come back to and get from a second reread. It's a story that's going to reward a reread, because very early on in the story, it sort of alludes to the overarching story of what this particular narrative is going to be about. So this is a quote on page 31, and this is Ogion, kind of Ged's first teacher, talking about the need for I guess almost patience and paying attention and being quite attentive, but Ged at this age is quite young. So this is the quote. "The girl herself is half a witch already. It may be the mother who sent the girl to talk to you. It may be she who opened the book on the page you read. The powers she serves are not the powers I serve. I do not know her will, but I know she does not will me well. Ged, listen to me now. Have you never thought how danger must surround power as shadow does light? This sorcery is not a game we play for pleasure or for praise. Think of this, that every word, every act of our art is said and is done either for good or for evil. Before you speak or do, you must know the price that is to pay." So you see there, I mean, just the language itself is just wonderful. The way the sentences flow there is absolutely beautiful. There's obviously, like I said, it's just an interesting idea on a storytelling perspective, but of course you can peel it back and understand a bit more that actions have consequences. And that's kind of alluding to what the rest of the story is going to be about. But it's a really interesting period that this particular passage comes in, because Ged at this age is quite young. He's impressionable. He doesn't really understand the world. A lot of young kids don't understand history and learning from history because they're too young to even have their own history to comprehend themselves. And so they're really eager to grow up and to get on with things. And they're quite rash and they're quite egotistical because they don't understand the consequence of their actions. And at this stage, Ged is all of those things. He's a young up-and-coming magician that wants to be the absolute best, and he wants to sort of expand very quickly and grow into this role very quickly, but he doesn't understand the nature of slowing down and paying close attention. He wants to be the biggest, the baddest, the fastest, the coolest, all these kind of things that you kind of wish when you're young. But Ogion there is trying to be like, no, you just need to pay attention sometimes. You need to scale it back. You need to understand what you're actually doing. And Ged doesn't not heed these words, but he does move on quite quickly from Ogion, which is a shame because I quite liked Ogion as a character. And he goes to this school of magic where he then gets into this magical jewel and unleashes this dark shade that follows him. And I really, really loved this particular passage, but then of course the overarching story of Ged from that perspective, because it does feel like it's a story of understanding consequence. And even though he's quite young at this stage in the story, he and us, everyone, can do things when they're young and impressionable, between the ages of 12 to 16, I think it is in this story. you can do things that will follow you around for the rest of your life until you face them in some regard. And I just really appreciated that kind of idea of, yes, sometimes you need to slow down. Sometimes you need to pay attention to your actions. If you don't, these actions can have consequences. And it's an idea in literature that I'm really interested by, actually, this idea of, things having consequences, or actions having consequences, and that playing out on a larger scale. It's something that I read in Thomas Covenant's The First Chronicles of Thomas Covenant that I did last year by Stephen Donaldson. It's kind of like there's an absolutely incredibly disgusting act that happens quite early in the first book, and the next two books are all about the consequence of those actions and how they play out on a larger kind of scale. So I really did appreciate that idea, and that she's kind of alluding to it. Ursula's kind of alluding to it quite early in the story, but of course, Ged's not heeding the words because he's just too young, he's impressionable, he's just looking to move on and grow within himself. And that's exactly half kind of the issue, is that when you're this age, when you are this young, you can't learn from someone telling you what to do. You actually kind of need to learn from experience. You need to go out there and, as a young child, someone says, don't touch that, that's too hot. What do you need to do? You need to actually touch the pan yourself and get burnt and realize, ow, if I touch the hot pan, it's hot. You actually need to learn from those kind of mistakes. And it's kind of like a balancing act, I guess, because on one hand, yes, you do need to learn from the physicality of, your actions and mistakes that way, but obviously there is a level where you take it absolutely too far, which Ged does by unleashing this shadow creature accidentally, but he doesn't quite understand the magic he's using at this stage. And it's just understanding that magic is an incredibly powerful thing and can have, very lasting consequences upon the world. So on one hand, it's incredibly bad that it happens, but on the other hand, it's also very good because, one, it gives us a very cool story, but two, of course, Ged learns that magic is an incredibly powerful force that he needs to understand in a different way and control. Of course, every fantasy series is not complete without a good old-fashioned dragon, or a couple of dragons in this case. I believe it was Tolkien who said a fantasy story is not worth telling unless there's dragons. And there are dragons in this, and they play a wonderful role. I really enjoyed the conversation that Ged and the chief dragon is. I can't even remember if they had a name. I don't think they did. But either way, Ged and this dragon have a very cool conversation. It was the inspiration for this week's artwork. And it's interesting because the story feels quite loose, I guess. It doesn't feel like there's this real direction that the story's going on, because it's just kind of Ged starts to move into the position of a wizard and starts to perform these acts as a wizard, and starts to almost, it feel like, go about the day-by-day business of what a wizard would do in this world. And because of that, it does feel like an incredibly comforting story. There is this overarching tension of this shadow following Ged. But in terms of like a second and third and fourth book, I actually had no idea where the story was going at this stage. And to be honest, I still technically don't know where the story is going, but I'll speak more about that in the second half of the episode. But at this stage, I was kind of like, what is the overarching story of this fantasy series? Where are we going? It's obviously said that Ged is an incredibly powerful and likely to become, the most powerful archmage of this world. But there doesn't seem to be any kind of tension or reason for him to be stepping into this position. At least, maybe I missed it. But there didn't seem to be. And so I was kind of like, well, what are we doing here? What's going on? It's an incredibly nice story and I'm enjoying it, but where's book 2 going to go? Obviously, I'll get into that in the second half of this episode. But for that reason, it was just kind of like this really, I guess, different kind of fantasy experience, because it felt almost like a day-to-day fantasy experience. He's just going about his business. He's sort of saving this town from the dragons, and then he's moving over to this part of the world and doing this little task, all the while being followed by this shadow. And I don't know, it felt quite homely. It felt quite small, not in a bad way, but it did feel quite comforting for that reason. It didn't feel like we were on this absolutely epic quest. It felt quite introspective for that reason. And I really enjoyed it. I don't want to say I won't spoil the ending, because, everyone deserves a chance to read these stories. But of course, we know there is a book 2. I'm about to speak about book 2. So in some regard, Ged obviously doesn't die from the shadow thing. And, the way he comes to that conclusion, or the way this story concludes, I think does come to a really nice and natural and comforting end. And I think quite an important end as to how it actually resolves itself. So I really, really enjoyed that. All in all, I thought it was a really beautiful story. I mean, Ursula K. Le Guin's writing style is just top tier. It's really simple prose, but ferries you along in such a beautiful way. Hopefully you got some of the magic there in the quotes that I read. But it is incredibly picturesque. I guess that's probably what I take from it. There was not really a scene that I read where I did not feel I could not picture the scene almost completely. And sometimes, especially in fantasy, I struggle to picture the world that I'm in, but this was incredibly picturesque. The images that were in my head as I was reading this story were incredibly vivid, were incredibly clear, and that's just a testament to Ursula's writing style. So that to me was probably the sparkling moment of this, is that it felt incredibly visual. I don't think there's any kind of like TV or movie adaptations of this, and I'm not sure why. I know there's been some great, I think it's a graphic novel made, and I absolutely want to get my hands on that because it does feel incredibly visual. So what would I rate the first book, The Wizard of Earthsea, out of 5? Honestly, 4.5, maybe even 4.6, maybe even 4.7. It's quite high up there. I really, really enjoyed it. But that, of course, is just part 1. Did you truly think them dead? You know better in your heart they do not die. They are dark and undying, and they hate the light, the brief, bright light of our mortality. They are immortal, but they are not gods. They never were. They are not worth the worship of any human soul. Wow, back again. Here we are, book 2, The Tombs of Atuan. That was incredibly quick. This book, The Tombs of Atuan, like I said in the first half of this episode, I had no idea where this series was going. And starting The Tombs of Atuan, I actually had to Google to check that it was actually a series, because The Tombs of Atuan starts and you've got a completely new cast of characters. There is no mention of Ged. We've got a completely new, frontman, but it is actually a young girl. And it was incredibly different, change of tone, change of pace, change of story. And I was incredibly confused. But I wasn't confused for very long because the story is absolutely wonderful. So yeah, I had to actually Google and make sure that it was actually part of a series, and it is. Ged does come into it a bit later in the story, but more or less this story is following a girl, and this story is a lot, it feels a lot more closed in. It is a lot more closed in, I should say, because it takes place sort of in one section of this world. It does feel a lot more personal, which I think is ironic because ultimately it's an incredibly impersonal story. It's following this girl Tenar, who is born in this part of the world, and on the day that the high priestess of this particular religion dies, the servants, the acolytes, go out and find the baby girl that was born on the day that the high priestess died, and that must mean that that baby girl is the high priestess reincarnated. So the high priestess dies, and then this particular young girl is taken away, and that girl is Tenar. She is then raised as the high priestess. She goes through her training until she, of course, is old enough to take the mantle of high priestess, where she then serves out her days in this pretty much cult, serving the nameless ones, these gods. And like I said, it feels like this an incredibly personal story. That, by the way, was an incredibly brief overview, which again probably did not do justice to the story, but it feels like this incredibly personal story because you're more or less following this girl Tenar. But it's incredibly impersonal as well because Tenar loses her name. She's stripped of her name when she becomes the high priestess, when she's taken from her family. She of course loses her family, her sense of agency and belonging to that family. She loses her name, and then of course she spends her days serving the nameless ones, which are gods that have no names. And that's sort of why it's this incredibly impersonal story, but it is quite personal as well. Something else I did notice is there does seem to be this, I want to say, fascination with names and the absence of names. So I didn't want to talk about this in the first section in the Wizard of Earthsea. I wanted to talk about it in this episode because it's a bit more prevalent in this episode. But Ged, you can't actually reveal your name to people in this world if you're a wizard, or it might be other people as well. But if you reveal your name, it's kind of giving them a power over you. It's like they know you sort of on a more personal level now. It's like a really personal thing to know someone's name, and it actually gives them a power over you. And in this story, it's much the same. Tenar is, of course, stripped of her name. She's serving nameless gods. So there seems to be this wonderful interplay with names throughout this story that I'm really fascinated in. I'm not sure if it's going to play any, really large overarching narrative structure in the story itself. It obviously does play a factor in the first story. It does play a little factor in this one because the story then becomes more or less Tenar sort of finding her agency within herself and reclaiming who she actually is, I guess, through the course of this story, because at the moment she's just a relatively young girl that has been stripped of her name, serving a cult that serves under the guise of a patriarchal society. So it is a story more or less about that. But yeah, it's this incredibly cool story, and I don't know what it was about this story. I think it's just the complete shift of pace that I think I really enjoyed. I think it's also just the idea of like being in a cult. I don't actually want to be in a cult myself, but following a story of this, priestess in a religious cult serving these gods within these tombs that just kind of, is the right kind of codifying of history, is the right kind of codifying of religion. It's all this wonderful interplay of the two and how they interact, and this kind of like mystery surrounding them that I think just tickles me the right way and is my kind of story, because I really did enjoy it. Ged, of course, does come in and he shows up sort of halfway. He breaks into the tombs and he's trying to steal some treasure, and Tenar sort of captures him and entraps him in the tomb, and she's meant to kill him, and she's kind of meant to kill everyone that breaks into the tombs, and she does kill these particular people early on in the story in a very kind of, I think, evil way, but she does absolutely regret it. She doesn't like doing it. She leaves him in the pitch darkness to starve to death, which would be an absolutely horrible way to go. And so she captures Ged, and she's uncertain what to do with him. She knows she has kind of a job to do, a duty to do as High Priestess to fulfill the necessary requirements of what happens when someone breaks into the tomb. She knows this. She's very aware of this. She wrestles with this. And this is kind of where she starts to understand, or maybe she doesn't understand, but we as the reader start to understand that even though she's been adopted into this role of High Priestess, and even though she's been stripped of her family and her name, that there is still someone beyond the High Priestess behind that curtain. And she starts to wrestle with, how should I deal with this character? And she ends up having some conversations with Ged, and they develop a relationship. I don't want to say relationship in terms of anything like they fall in love or anything like that, but it's this relationship of she's been in this role of High Priestess literally since the day she was born, more or less. And so she's never experienced the outside world, and Ged is kind of like, no, leave this silly little cult, and there's a whole world out there. And it's kind of like the wonderful, interplay of those kind of conversations that go on that I think make this story really interesting. It was just a complete shifting of pace that I think I just absolutely loved in this story. And, as I said in the first one, I didn't know where this story was going. I still don't know where the story is going, because it feels like just two separate stories occupying the same universe. And even though Ged, of course, appears in both, there's still not like an overarching narrative that like is driving me to the third story there. Where I'm like, okay, I definitely know what's going to happen. It's not like Lord of the Rings where you've got sort of a quest being fulfilled or something like that. It does just feel like isolated stories. And I think it's really wonderful, because even though it reads as quite traditional fantasy, it is also quite different in that respect, because there isn't an overarching quest narrative that's driving the story. It does feel like it's isolated stories, and you can actually just read the Tombs of Atuan first if you really wanted to. If you didn't really enjoy the first one, you could jump to the second and have a completely different relationship with these stories, and also not really lose anything beyond the fact that Ged is a wizard. So I really enjoy that. So it does read as this, very typical fantasy, but also explores very different things as well. And I mean, Ged has dark skin, and Tenar is, of course, a female. And this was written in the 60s, which we might make jokes about now and go, shh, don't tell anyone he has dark skin and she's a female. But these were incredibly big things back then to consider. So, it's a female writer writing about a dark-skinned person and a female as the lead characters. That's a huge aspect to consider when considering the context of these stories. And this, of course, is not something that I even consider now. I'm not sitting there going, oh my God, he has dark skin. That's terrible. It's just something that you've definitely got to respect, I guess, Ursula for taking these risks as a writer in that period of time in the United States of America. You've definitely got to respect it and pay homage to it. So I really enjoy that. But, for me, it obviously isn't a huge factor at all, because I am not a racist or a sexist. So there we go. So let's finish there. I think The Wizard of Earthsea and The Tombs of Atuan, two absolutely fantastic stories. Two very isolated stories, but let's see where the third story goes. I've just started reading it. There does seem to be a bit of a time jump. Like I said, if you are aware, if I do need to read the fourth story to round out the general arc of the stories, please do let me know. I would appreciate that kind of advice, because it does seem a bit uncertain. My understanding is that I probably need to read the 4 books, otherwise why would you sell the first 4 books in this copy? But I know there are 6 books, so I'm uncertain as to, maybe it's just a choice that Penguin has made to release the first 4 books. I don't know what's going on. Yeah, please do let me know if you do know. So what would I rate the Tombs of Atuan out of 5? I think exactly the same, 4.5 to 4.7, and it was an absolutely thrilling tale. I think it was almost better than the first one. I think the first one obviously maybe edges it because it's of course the introductory novel and it introduces us to so much. You know, the first one's incredibly large, sweeping story, whereas this one's quite tight, dark, and introspective, but both have shining qualities that really make them really enjoyable reads. So I really enjoyed it. Yeah, 4.5 to 4.7 for both of these. I cannot wait to really sink my teeth into the third book. Yeah, make sure you tune in next month for the third, possibly fourth book. Thanks so much for tuning in, guys, all the way to the end. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed the episode. As always, if you would like to like and subscribe, I would greatly appreciate that. But as always, I just hope to see you next time. And today, I think I'm going to round us out with a quote. This is from the chapter The Great Treasure, page 249. And the quote goes, "The silence and the dark. You know everything, wizard, but I know one thing. The one true thing."